was a cold morning when she stepped off the old bus that stopped in front of the city's grand concert hall. The air was filled with the sound of chatter, laughter, and nervous voices. People were rushing inside, carrying folders of sheet music, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Among them walked a woman whose presence almost went unnoticed, plain, quiet, and holding nothing but a small, worn-out handbag. Her hair was tied loosely in a bun, and her dress looked simple, the kind that had been washed and ironed too many times. She walked slowly, looking at the huge building that stood before her like a palace made of glass and sound. For years, she had only seen such places on television. Music halls like this belonged to another world, a world of people with money, training, and connections. Yet here she was, standing among them, ready to audition. Her heart beat fast, but she kept walking, one careful step after another, clutching her form that had the number 47 written on it in blue ink. Inside the hall, the world seemed too bright, too loud, and too perfect. Young contestants were warming up on small keyboards placed in the corner. Some stretched their fingers gracefully, others hummed softly, testing their vocal control. She could hear bits of conversation, confident, proud, and slightly cruel. "Did you see that lady? She looks like she got lost," one girl whispered to another, covering her mouth to hide her laugh. "Maybe she came to clean the place," another joked. The woman heard them but pretended not to. She simply smiled faintly and sat down on one of the wooden benches, folding her hands on her lap. Her palms were sweating and her knees felt weak, but she didn't let fear take over. She had promised herself long ago that no matter how people saw her, she would never let their words define her worth. Still, it wasn't easy. Every laugh, every whisper cut like a small knife. As the audition began, one by one, contestants were called in. She watched them disappear behind the large doors and return with mixed expressions, some smiling proudly, others in tears. The young man sitting next to her was tapping his feet impatiently. "Are you competing too?" he asked, his tone slightly surprised. "Yes," she said softly. He raised his brows and muttered under his breath, "Interesting," before turning away. She didn't know why people looked at her that way. Maybe it was her clothes, maybe her age, or maybe because she didn't fit the image of what a performer should look like. But she knew something they didn't. Behind that simple appearance was a lifetime of stories, and every one of them had a melody. She had played through loss, through hunger, through long nights where silence was heavier than sound. Each time life broke her heart, she had gone back to the piano, her only true friend. When her number was called, she stood up slowly. Her legs trembled, but she took a deep breath. The door to the audition room looked larger than it should. As she walked toward it, she heard a few contestants whisper again. "She's really going in," someone said with a giggle. Another voice added, "This is going to be funny." The laughter followed her like a shadow, but she didn't turn back. She pressed the handle and the door opened with a quiet creak. The audition room was enormous, with soft lighting and a single grand piano standing under a spotlight. 3 judges sat behind a long table, flipping through papers and murmuring to each other. They looked up as she entered, their expressions polite but distant. "Name?" one of them asked, without even looking directly at her. She gave her name quietly and handed over her form. The oldest judge adjusted his glasses and looked at her for a long moment. "Are you ready?" he said, his tone carrying a hint of disbelief. She nodded, though her throat felt dry. The youngest judge leaned back and said with a small smirk, "Whenever you're ready, take your time." It wasn't kindness, and it was the kind of politeness people use when they don't expect much. She walked toward the piano. Her steps echoed softly on the polished floor. For a moment she stood still in front of it, staring at the smooth black surface that reflected her image faintly. She could almost see her younger self, the girl who once dreamed of standing on a stage like this. The girl who used to sneak into the small-town church at night, just to play a few notes on the dusty old piano there. That piano had missing keys and a broken leg, but it had been her world. Her hands trembled as she reached out and touched the cool keys of the grand piano. They felt strange, cleaner, heavier, more powerful. She could feel hundreds of eyes behind her, waiting. The judges leaned forward slightly, one of them resting his chin on his hand, watching her. She sat down slowly, adjusted the small stool, and placed her fingers gently on the keyboard. A deep breath, a short pause, and silence spread through the room. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The quietness grew uncomfortable. Someone coughed softly in the back. She could hear faint laughter outside the door. Contestants still joking, still not taking her seriously. In that silence, her heart began to speak louder than her fear. She remembered her husband's face, his tired smile, his words, "Don't ever stop playing, no matter how small the audience." She remembered the smell of her parents' bakery, the nights she'd worked late kneading dough, then played music until dawn. She remembered her son clapping for her during the only small-town performance she ever gave. All those moments filled her heart, and suddenly the room around her disappeared. There were no judges, no laughter, no bright lights, only her and the piano. Her fingers pressed the first key. The sound was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried warmth. Then another note followed, then another, forming a slow, gentle rhythm, the kind that comes not from training but from a life lived with emotion. The music started to fill the empty air, and for the first time the judges stopped writing and looked at her. Her posture changed, no longer nervous, no longer small. Her shoulders straightened, her fingers danced across the keys with growing confidence. It was as if something deep inside her had awakened. Each note carried years of unspoken pain and hope. She didn't just play the piano. She told a story of a woman who had lived quietly, loved deeply, and never stopped believing in beauty even when the world was cruel. Outside, a few people pressed their ears to the door. The laughter was gone. The same contestants who had mocked her now listened in silence, confused by what they heard. The melody was unlike anything they had expected, full of raw feeling, the kind that no music academy could teach. Inside, the judges exchanged glances. The older one leaned forward, his expression softening. The middle-aged judge who had smirked earlier now sat completely still, his pen frozen above the paper. Her hands moved faster, the sound rising and falling like waves, filling the entire hall with emotion. The woman's eyes closed as she played. She wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. She wasn't playing to win a prize. She was playing for herself, for every moment in her life when she had felt invisible, unheard, and underestimated. Each note was a voice she never had the courage to use in words. The final note hung in the air for a long moment before fading away. When she opened her eyes, the room was utterly silent. The judges were motionless, their faces unreadable. She looked at them nervously, expecting criticism or indifference. But instead there was something unexpected. Quiet awe. One of the judges slowly put down his pen and whispered, "That was beautiful." Another nodded slightly, still staring at her hands. She didn't know what to say. For her, it wasn't a performance. It was a confession of everything she had ever felt. As she stood up, her knees felt weak again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from release, as if years of silence had finally broken. She bowed politely and turned to leave, her heart pounding but strangely light. Outside, as she stepped through the doors, the contestants who had mocked her earlier were quiet now. No one said a word. A few looked away, ashamed. She walked past them with a soft smile, her eyes glistening slightly. She didn't need their approval anymore. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not because of how she looked, but because of what she carried inside. And even though she didn't know what the judge's final decision would be, she had already won something much bigger than a competition. She walked out of the hall into the soft afternoon light. The city seemed different now, warmer, kinder, quieter. She clutched her small handbag and took one deep breath of cold air. Somewhere behind her, the sound of another piano audition began, but she was already walking away, her heart still humming the melody she had just played. She didn't realize it yet, but that simple performance, that honest, heartfelt moment, would soon change everything. It had been many years since her life had last felt peaceful. The woman everyone had quietly mocked that day was once a girl filled with dreams, music, and laughter. Her story began in a small town far from the bright lights and shining pianos of the city. It was a place where mornings smelled of freshly baked bread, and evenings were quiet enough to hear the wind moving through the trees. Her parents owned a tiny bakery that stood at the corner of the main street. Every morning before sunrise, she would wake up to the sound of her father kneading dough, and her mother humming a soft tune as she prepared the oven. As a child, she loved those sounds. To her, life felt like music even back then. The crackling of fire in the oven, the clinking of cups, the soft rustle of paper bags. but nothing compared to the first time she heard the church piano. It was an old, cracked instrument that stood in the corner of the small church her family visited every Sunday. The first time her fingers touched its keys, something magical happened inside her. The uneven notes didn't matter. She felt a strange peace, as if the world had suddenly slowed down and every sound had a meaning. Her parents noticed the sparkle in her eyes whenever she was near the piano. They couldn't afford lessons, but they encouraged her to play whenever she could. "If music makes you happy," her father once told her, wiping flour from his hands, "then it's worth every moment you give to it." And so, every evening after finishing her chores, she would run to the church, sit on the hard wooden bench and teach herself to play. Sometimes she would press a wrong key, laugh quietly, and start again. Her music was simple, raw, but full of heart. As she grew older, her love for music only deepened. She dreamed of studying piano in a big city, of performing on a stage in front of an audience. But dreams don't always grow where there's little soil to hold them. Life in her small town was hard. Her father fell sick when she was 16, and the family's savings quickly disappeared on medicine. The bakery, once full of warmth and laughter, started to struggle. Customers became fewer, the shelves emptier. She had to leave school to help her mother run the shop. The days were long and tiring. Her hands, once made for piano keys, now kneaded dough and carried heavy trays. But every night, no matter how exhausted she felt, she still found her way to that church. Sometimes she played in darkness, guided only by moonlight that fell through the small window. It was during those nights that her music began to change. The melodies became softer, deeper, filled with longing. They were no longer just songs. They were pieces of her heart, quietly speaking to the empty room. Years passed and her father's health worsened. The day he passed away, she couldn't even cry. She simply walked to the church, sat at the piano, and played for hours without stopping. Every note was a memory, his laughter, his voice, his words telling her to never stop. The people in the town could hear the music through the open doors, and many stood outside silently, letting her grief speak for them all. That night, the church didn't feel empty. It felt like her father was there, listening. Time moved forward, as it always does. The bakery closed eventually, and she began working odd jobs to survive. She taught local children simple songs and played at small community events when someone needed background music. People liked her presence, quiet, humble, and full of kindness. She was the kind of woman who always smiled even when her eyes told a different story. Then came the man who would later become her husband. He wasn't rich or famous, but he had a kind heart. They met when she was hired to play music at a small local event where he was fixing the lights. He admired how deeply she felt the music, and she admired his calm strength. Their love wasn't dramatic or filled with grand gestures. It was simple, steady, and real. Together they built a small life. He worked hard. She continued teaching children. And in the evenings they would sit together while she played soft tunes on an old second-hand piano he had bought for her. But as fate often does, life tested her again. After years of struggle, he fell ill too. The same cruel pattern that had taken her father. The hospital bills drained what little they had. She tried to stay strong, working extra hours, still playing at local gatherings when she could. But one night he looked at her with tired eyes and said, "Promise me something. Never stop playing. That's who you are." Those were his last words before he closed his eyes forever. She kept that promise. Even when loneliness filled the house, even when silence felt unbearable, she played. Her music became her prayer. She didn't need an audience. The walls, the wind, and her memories were enough. But deep down, she always wished for one chance. Just one moment where she could show the world that even simple people, those who live quietly and humbly, could hold oceans inside their hearts. Years later, that chance came in the form of a small flyer pinned to the grocery store notice board. It announced an open audition for a piano competition in the city. Everyone welcome. She stared at the paper for a long time. The idea felt foolish. She was older now, her hands no longer smooth, her clothes plain, but something inside her stirred. It wasn't ambition. It was that same quiet voice that had guided her as a child, the one that whispered, "Play." She tore the flyer from the board and folded it carefully, placing it in her bag. For days she couldn't sleep properly. Doubts filled her mind. They won't take you seriously, she thought. You've never had training. You'll embarrass yourself. But each time fear spoke, another memory rose to answer. Her father's encouragement, her husband's final promise. Those voices gave her courage. She began practicing again every night after finishing her chores. The piano in her small house was old and slightly out of tune, but she didn't mind. Her fingers remembered the keys even when her heart hesitated. Sometimes she would stop and close her eyes, imagining the sound of the grand piano she had only seen on television. She practiced one particular piece over and over, a song she had written herself years ago, one that carried every emotion she had ever felt. The neighbors often stopped outside her window to listen. Children whispered to each other, "That lady plays like in the movies." She smiled when she heard them. For the first time in a long while, she felt alive again. Music filled her home, washing away the loneliness. When the day of the audition finally came, she woke before dawn. The city was far, and she had to take 2 buses to get there. She packed her handbag with the audition form, a bottle of water, and an old photograph of her husband. "You're coming with me," she whispered, tucking the photo safely inside. The journey was long and bumpy. She sat quietly near the window, watching fields and towns pass by. Her reflection in the glass looked older, but her eyes still carried that same light. On the way, she thought about everything she had been through, all the years she had hidden her music from the world because she thought she wasn't good enough. She promised herself that even if no one clapped, even if they laughed, she would play her heart out. By the time she reached the city, the streets were already crowded. Tall buildings rose above her like towers, and the concert hall where the auditions were being held looked grand and intimidating. She stood in front of it for a few minutes, holding her bag tightly, unsure if she should go inside. A group of young contestants walked past her, laughing loudly, their clothes shiny and modern. They looked at her curiously but said nothing. She could feel their eyes on her, but she ignored it. Finally, she took a deep breath and walked through the glass doors. The smell of polish and perfume filled the air. She went to the registration desk, handed her form to the woman sitting there, and received a small badge with her number. "Number 47, the woman said politely. "Please wait until you're called." She found a seat near the corner of the waiting area, away from the crowd. From there, she could watch the others, young, confident, with their perfect posture and stylish clothes. They looked like they belonged there. She didn't, but that didn't matter anymore. She wasn't there to fit in. She was there to honor the people who had believed in her when no one else did. As she waited, her hands trembled slightly. She rubbed them together to keep them warm. A few contestants looked her way and whispered something, followed by quiet laughter. She heard them but kept her gaze fixed on the floor. Her heart raced, but she reminded herself of all those nights alone with the piano, all the songs that had carried her through pain. Her name would soon be called. She knew the moment would come when she'd have to walk into that bright room and face the judges. And even though fear tried to crawl into her chest, she also felt something else. Peace. Because she had already faced life's hardest stages, and this was just another one. That was the woman they laughed at during the audition. They saw only her worn dress and quiet manner, but they didn't see the years behind her. The sleepless nights, the lost loved ones, the faith that never faded. They didn't know that every wrinkle on her hands was a line of music she had written through living. What awaited her beyond that door wasn't just an audition. It was the moment her whole life had been leading to. She didn't know if she would win or lose. All she knew was that when her fingers touched the piano again, she would play not for the judges, not for the audience, but for herself and for everyone who ever dared to dream long, after the world stopped believing in them. The door to the audition room closed behind her with a soft sound that echoed louder in her mind than it really was. For a brief moment, she just stood there, frozen in the doorway, trying to calm the storm inside her chest. The hall was large, elegant, and intimidating. Its walls were lined with framed photographs of past winners, young men and women dressed perfectly, smiling confidently at the camera. She looked at them for a second and whispered quietly to herself, "Let's see what happens." A grand piano stood in the center of the stage under a warm golden light. It gleamed like a mirror, reflecting everything around it. For a woman who had spent her whole life playing an old wooden piano with faded keys, this sight felt unreal. The smell of polished wood and faint perfume from the judges' table mixed in the air. 3 judges sat facing her, each with papers and pens, their expressions calm but unreadable. "Number 47, the man in the middle asked, glancing up from his notes. She nodded softly and stepped forward, holding her small handbag close to her chest. The woman on the left, wearing glasses and a tight smile, looked at her for a few seconds. "Whenever you're ready," she said, in a tone that carried both politeness and disbelief. The contestant before her had played a fast, complicated classical piece. The judges had clapped briefly, praised his technique, and then returned to their notes. But this was different. When she walked in, she felt all three pairs of eyes measuring her: her simple dress, her old shoes, her uncertain smile. There was no music degree next to her name, no formal training written on her form. Just her age, her hometown, and the title of the piece she would play, Echoes of the Heart. She walked slowly toward the piano, feeling every step like it carried the weight of her entire life. The stage lights felt hot against her skin. Her palms were sweaty, and she could hear the faint sound of people murmuring outside the door, other contestants waiting for their turn. Some of them were probably still laughing about her. But here, in this moment, everything else faded away. When she reached the piano, she stopped and stared at it. Her reflection looked back at her from its surface. For a second, she saw herself as that little girl in the village church again, sitting alone on a cracked bench, her fingers pressing soft, uncertain notes into the quiet. A memory so clear it made her throat tighten. She sat down slowly. The chair creaked under her weight. She adjusted it the way she used to at home, lowering herself just enough to let her hands rest naturally on the keys. The sound of her own breathing filled her ears. She could feel her heart pounding so loudly that it almost drowned out everything else. One of the judges cleared his throat. "You may begin," he said, his voice distant but formal. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Her mind whispered 1,000 doubts. What if you make a mistake? What if they laugh? What if you're not good enough? Then another voice, gentler, older, spoke in her memory. It was her husband's voice. "Play for yourself, not for them." She took a deep breath. Then with trembling fingers, she pressed the first key. The sound was soft and hesitant at first. It filled the large room like a whisper in a cathedral. One of the judges raised an eyebrow, perhaps expecting her to stop, to apologize, to say she was nervous. But she didn't stop. She moved to the next note and then another, and suddenly a melody began to form. Fragile, trembling, but real. It wasn't the kind of polished, technical piece that most contestants played. It was different. It felt like a story, slow, full of emotion, each note carrying weight, as if she was telling something too personal for words. Her hands stopped shaking. Her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes closed halfway as the music took control. It was as if her body remembered something her mind had forgotten, the way music used to flow through her like breath, like heartbeat. The judges exchanged quiet looks. One of them leaned slightly forward, resting her chin on her hand. The smirk that had been there when she entered slowly faded away. The man in the center, who had been scribbling something on his paper, stopped writing. The melody grew stronger. The notes rose and fell like waves, sometimes soft as a sigh, sometimes sharp as pain. The room, which had felt so cold a few minutes earlier, began to fill with warmth. Every sound she made came straight from the deepest part of her. From years of struggle, from nights of loneliness, from the quiet promise she had made to herself never to stop playing. Outside the door, the noise in the waiting area started to fade. The contestants waiting for their turn began to listen. A few of them leaned closer, trying to hear better. The tune was unlike anything they had heard that day. Not perfect, not precise, but pure and alive. Back inside, she was no longer afraid. Her mind drifted between memories. She saw her father, smiling faintly from across the bakery counter. She saw her mother humming softly as she packed bread for customers. She saw her husband sitting beside her, his eyes closed, listening. Each image came and went with the rhythm of the music. When her hands moved across the high keys, the melody turned lighter, like a sunrise breaking through long nights. Then as she reached the final section, it slowed again, heavy with emotion. Every note was a memory released, every pause a deep breath of truth. The last few notes came softly, fading into silence like a whisper disappearing into the air. When she lifted her hands off the keys, the sound lingered in the room for a heartbeat before vanishing completely. Then there was silence. No one spoke. The judges just stared at her. The audience behind the doors stayed quiet too. For the first time since she had entered, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel old or out of place. She felt alive, calm, light, almost free. Finally, the oldest judge spoke. His voice was low and steady. "That was unexpected," he said. The others didn't respond right away, still lost in thought. The woman with glasses finally said softly, "It was beautiful." She didn't know what to say. Her hands were still resting on her lap, slightly shaking from the emotion that had just flowed through them. She gave a small nod, whispering, "Thank you." The man in the middle leaned forward. "Did you write that piece yourself?" he asked. "Yes," she said quietly. "A long time ago." He paused, studying her face. "It's very moving." She could feel tears forming in her eyes, but she held them back. "It's just a memory," she said simply. They thanked her politely and told her she could go. She stood slowly, clutching her handbag again. As she turned toward the door, one of the judges called out softly, "You have something special." She smiled faintly, nodded, and left the room without another word. The moment she stepped back into the waiting hall, the air felt different. Everyone who had been whispering earlier now sat quietly. A few looked at her with new eyes. The same young girl who had laughed when she first arrived now lowered her gaze in silence. The man who had joked about her appearance before shifted uncomfortably in his seat. No one dared to speak. She didn't look at them for long. She simply walked past, calm and graceful, as if she didn't even notice their change of heart. Her steps were light now. Each one felt like she was walking away from years of doubt. When she finally reached the door leading outside, she paused for a second. She could still hear faint music coming from inside. Another contestant had started playing. But to her, the world was already quiet again. She pushed open the door and stepped into the afternoon sunlight. Outside, the city was busy as always, cars honking, people rushing past. But she didn't hear any of it clearly. Her ears were still full of her own melody. She walked slowly down the street, her handbag pressed to her chest, a small smile on her face. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like someone who had been left behind by the world. She felt like someone who had finally found her place again. She didn't know if the judges would pick her. She didn't know if her name would ever appear on a winner's list or if the world would ever hear her story. But that didn't matter anymore. In that quiet hall, she had played everything she was, everything she had lost, and everything she still believed in. Somewhere inside her, she felt her father's voice again. "If music makes you happy, it's worth every moment." She smiled, looked up at the sky and whispered, "I did it. Papa." The wind brushed against her face as she walked toward the bus stop. The city lights began to turn on one by one as evening slowly arrived. She knew that when she went home, she would sit at her small piano again and play the same piece. Not to practice it this time, but to relive it. Inside that audition room, something had changed forever. What began as fear had turned into freedom, and though no one knew it yet, the melody she played that day would soon echo far beyond those walls. The moment she sat back at her small piano at home, the music seemed different than ever before. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was memory. It was release. It was life itself. That audition had been more than a test of skill. It had been a confrontation with years of doubt, sorrow, and hope. She pressed her fingers to the keys, feeling their familiar weight, and began to play echoes of the heart again. This time she allowed herself to linger in every note, to stretch each sound until it carried the story she had always carried silently within her. Her house was small and cozy, the kind that smelled faintly of old wood and tea. The walls were lined with photographs, a young girl smiling with her father, a husband's hand resting gently on hers, moments she had cherished quietly over the years. Tonight, those memories seemed alive, joining her in her music. Every note brought back laughter, tears, and the quiet, steadfast love that had shaped her life. The first few nights after the audition, she couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed every moment, the skeptical looks, the whispers, the silence before she began playing, and then the unexpected stillness of the judges as her music filled the room. The memory of their faces haunted her in the best possible way. She had not only played, she had spoken without words, and the idea that people could finally understand even a fraction of her story left her feeling both exhilarated and vulnerable. Word of her performance began to spread quietly at first. A few of the contestants who had been waiting outside shared whispers about the woman who had played with such emotion. Some teachers at the music school mentioned her name to their students, but she didn't seek recognition. She wasn't playing for fame or applause. She was playing because music had always been her language, and she had finally spoken it aloud. When the judges called back for a second round of auditions, she was both nervous and strangely calm. She had prepared for this, yet she knew that no amount of preparation could capture the essence of what she carried inside. She entered the hall once again, her plain dress unchanged, her small handbag pressed against her side. The grand piano sat in the same golden light, gleaming and ready. She could hear the hum of conversation from other contestants, some of whom she recognized from the previous day. Their expressions were different now, a mix of curiosity and a quiet respect, though perhaps not fully conscious even to them. As she walked toward the piano, she noticed the judges exchanging glances. The oldest judge gave her a small nod, a gesture that felt both reassuring and serious. The woman with glasses smiled faintly, no longer the polite but distant observer she had been. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that what she was about to do was not just performance, but revelation. She sat down, adjusted the stool just as she had done countless times before, and placed her hands gently on the keys. Her fingers trembled slightly, but this time it was not fear. It was anticipation, the kind that comes from knowing that every note carries a truth too deep for words. The room fell silent as she began to play. The first note floated through the air like a gentle breeze, soft yet commanding. As she continued, the melody grew, weaving through moments of sorrow and joy, strength and vulnerability. She was no longer a woman standing before judges. She was a storyteller, and the piano was her voice. Her music moved differently now. Each chord seemed to expand, filling the room not just with sound but with emotion. The judges leaned forward, drawn into the world she was creating. Even the contestants outside the doors paused to listen, captivated by the raw honesty that spilled from her fingers. Some of them felt their own emotions stir, though they could not yet name what they were experiencing. The woman played as though the years of struggle and love had been compressed into this very moment. She remembered her father kneading dough in the bakery, his hands strong yet gentle, teaching her the value of patience and care. She remembered the nights she had spent alone in the church, her fingers pressing uneven keys under the soft glow of candlelight, finding comfort in the notes she could produce even when life felt unbearable. She remembered her husband, his quiet encouragement, his belief in her when she had begun to doubt herself, and she remembered the pain of loss, the loneliness that had settled in her chest after each goodbye. All of these memories flowed through her as she played, giving life to the music in ways that no sheet could teach. Her fingers moved with grace and power, rising and falling like waves, sometimes whispering, sometimes demanding attention. Every note told a story, and every pause carried the weight of years. It was a performance born not of technique alone, but of life itself, raw, honest, and impossible to ignore. The judges were silent, utterly absorbed. Their pens lay untouched, their faces reflecting awe and something deeper, recognition of a truth that went beyond music. They could not measure her skill in the usual ways because what she offered could not be measured. It was her life distilled into sound, an intimate confession that reached out and touched anyone willing to listen. Outside, the whispers of fellow contestants had ceased entirely. They had stopped laughing, stopped fidgeting, stopped comparing themselves to one another. In their place was silence, thick and heavy, as if the room itself had paused to witness what was unfolding inside. They could feel the power of the music even without understanding the full story behind it. The piece reached its crescendo, a surge of energy that filled every corner of the hall. Her hands flew over the keys with precision and emotion, the melody rising and falling in a way that seemed almost human in its breathing. It was not flawless, not mechanical, but it was alive. It was imperfectly perfect, and that imperfection made it all the more beautiful. Her eyes closed as she played the final notes, allowing herself to be completely absorbed by the sound. She felt the echoes of every memory, every loss, every joy vibrating through her fingertips. The room seemed to hold its breath as she pressed the last key, letting the note linger until it faded naturally into silence. When she opened her eyes, the room was still. The judges sat frozen for a heartbeat, as if trying to process the intensity of what they had just heard. Then slowly, the oldest judge leaned forward and said, "That was extraordinary." The woman with glasses nodded, her lips parted slightly in wonder. It is rare to see someone play with such Heart, she said softly, her tone almost reverent. The man in the middle looked at her intently. You don't just play the piano, he said. You speak through it. Your music has depth, emotion, life. She lowered her gaze not out of shame but out of humility. Thank you, she whispered. I just play what I feel. The judges exchanged glances again. They had heard many talented performers in their careers, some technically perfect, some impressive in appearance. But few had ever played like this, not with such honesty, such vulnerability. Her performance did not seek approval. It demanded understanding. And in that quiet insistence, it had captured their attention completely. As she stood up, her knees slightly shaky, the judges smiled. We would like you to advance to the next round, one said. The words felt almost surreal to her. She had not come for victory, and yet victory had found her in the form of acknowledgement, respect, and recognition. Stepping out of the room, she noticed a change in the atmosphere of the waiting area. Contestants who had previously laughed or whispered now looked at her with curiosity, even admiration. A few approached her cautiously, their words polite. Your music. It's incredible, one said. I've never heard anything like it, another added. She nodded and smiled softly, her eyes betraying nothing but quiet gratitude. She walked outside into the crisp air, letting it fill her lungs and calm her racing heart. The city around her seemed different now, brighter, more welcoming, almost alive with possibility. She had faced a room full of doubt and had emerged not just intact but stronger. She felt a deep satisfaction, a sense that she had finally done what she was meant to do. Her music had not only survived that room, it had transformed it. The laughter and ridicule that had greeted her at first were replaced by silence, awe, and perhaps a touch of humility from those who had doubted her. For her, this was proof that the world could not define her worth. Only her own dedication, persistence, and heart could do that. That night, she returned home, her small piano waiting. She played again, not for judges or audience, but for herself. Each note resonated differently now, richer and deeper than before. She could feel her own growth as a musician, a storyteller, and as a woman who had faced life's harshest tests and still carried beauty in her heart. The days following the audition were filled with a quiet buzz. People she had never met began asking about her, curious to see the woman who had captivated the judges. Teachers from music schools reached out, inviting her to perform or even to teach. She responded gently, always calm, never hurried. Fame was not her goal. Sharing the power of music was. She spent her evenings reflecting on what had happened. Each note she played carried memories of her father, her husband, her childhood, and her losses. She realized that the music itself had healed her in ways she had not known she needed. By sharing her story through sound, she had also reclaimed a part of herself that had been hidden, silent, and overlooked for so many years. And yet, despite the growing attention, she remained humble. She continued her quiet routines, walking through the small streets of her neighborhood, greeting familiar faces, visiting the old church where it had all begun. But now, when she passed the doors of the hall where she had been ridiculed and then admired, she felt a sense of peace. That place no longer held fear. It held memory, achievement, and the knowledge that she had stayed true to herself. Her life, though still simple, had changed. She had discovered the strength of her own voice, the power of her own persistence, and the ability to touch others without even speaking. The world had underestimated her because of appearances and age, but she had proved quietly and gracefully that music knows no bounds. It is not measured by technique or perfection alone, but by the honesty, emotion, and story behind every note. The woman, once ridiculed for her simplicity, now carried within her a confidence born from experience. She had faced the skepticism of strangers and transformed it into something greater than applause, understanding, connection, and the awakening of hearts. The melody she had created that day was no longer just a song. It was a testament to the resilience, courage, and beauty of a life fully lived. And as she sat back at her piano night after night, she played not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated. Her music had become a bridge between the past and the present, between her private world and the hearts of strangers, and between fear and the quiet, unstoppable strength that resides within every human being. The morning after her second audition, she woke with a quiet excitement she hadn't felt in years. Her body ached from nerves and anticipation, but her heart felt light as though the weight of decades of doubt had lifted, if only slightly. She sat at her small piano at home and replayed the melody from the audition in her mind. Each note felt like a heartbeat, each chord a whisper of the story she had lived. She knew that the next steps would not be easy. The judge's words had been kind, but praise was fleeting. It was still her dedication, her emotion, and her honesty that mattered most. The woman spent the morning preparing for the day ahead, going through small routines she had maintained for years. She boiled water for tea, wiped down the kitchen counter, and arranged her worn music sheets carefully on the table. Each movement was deliberate, a kind of ritual that grounded her. Her hands, though no longer as smooth as they had been in youth, moved with memory and confidence, as if the years of practice had carved their paths into her very bones. By midday, she left for the music hall again. This time, she took the bus with fewer people around. She noticed the city felt the same as before, bustling, indifferent, unrelenting. But something inside her had shifted. She walked with a quiet dignity, a small smile playing on her lips. The voices and laughter that once made her feel out of place now seemed distant, almost trivial. She carried herself not as someone seeking approval, but as someone who had already proven something fundamental to herself, that her music mattered, that her heart could speak. Upon reaching the hall, she noticed the atmosphere had changed. People were talking in hushed tones about her performance from the previous day. Contestants who had once whispered and laughed were now staring at her, some with curiosity, others with a quiet admiration. She did not seek their attention and continued to the registration desk without acknowledging them. Her number had been called early, so she did not have long to wait. She took a seat in a quiet corner, folding her hands in her lap, letting her thoughts drift. She remembered her father's hands kneading dough, the warmth of the bakery on winter mornings, the small moments with her husband, and the nights she had spent alone in the church playing music that no one would ever hear. All of it led to this moment, a chance not just to play but to share the life she had lived in sound. When her turn came, she walked into the audition room once more. The grand piano sat in its place, gleaming under the soft spotlight, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The judges looked up from their notes. The oldest man gave her a nod, and she returned it with a small, polite smile. She felt a flutter of nerves, but no longer the paralyzing fear that had gripped her the first day. Today she played with purpose, with intention, and with the knowledge that this was her moment. Her fingers rested on the keys for a moment before she began. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, but quickly transformed into a flowing, expressive melody. Each movement of her hands told a story, of loss, of hope, of quiet endurance. She allowed the music to breathe, to expand beyond the confines of the hall, to touch everyone present with the life she carried in her heart. The judges listened, captivated. Their pens were untouched. Their expressions were ones of surprise, awe, and silent contemplation. The younger judge, who had initially smirked at her, now leaned forward, fully absorbed. Her music was not about perfection. It was about honesty, about the courage to express one's soul through sound. Each chord resonated with the weight of her experiences, yet also with the lightness of someone who had survived and grown through adversity. Outside the doors, whispers floated as contestants stopped to listen. Some covered their mouths, unable to process what they were hearing. The melody was not flashy or designed to impress. It was profound, moving, and deeply human. It demanded attention not through technique but through truth, and that truth was undeniable. She closed her eyes as she continued to play, letting the memories flow through her fingertips. She imagined her father's encouragement, her husband's smile, and the small victories of her childhood. Each image colored the music, infusing it with layers of emotion that could not be replicated by anyone else. This was her life, distilled into sound, and for the first time it was being heard in its entirety. The melody rose and fell, carrying with it the rhythm of her life. Moments of sorrow were paired with glimpses of joy. Each note was deliberate yet instinctive, a reflection of her deep understanding of what it meant to endure, to love, and to hope. She did not falter. She did not rush. She allowed the music to unfold naturally, trusting in the years of practice, struggle, and reflection that had shaped her into the artist she was now. As she reached the climax of the piece, the hall seemed to hold its breath. The notes soared, filled with both intensity and grace. She felt the presence of every person she had ever loved, every moment she had ever cherished or lost. And with the final chord, she allowed herself a pause, letting the sound linger and fade gently, leaving behind a silence that was thick with emotion. The judges remained still for a moment, their faces betraying the weight of what they had just witnessed. Then the oldest judge spoke, his voice steady but filled with genuine admiration. "That was extraordinary," he said. The woman with glasses nodded slowly, her expression softened. "It is rare to encounter someone who plays not just with skill but with their entire life," she added. The third judge, who had been quiet until now, simply looked at her with a mixture of wonder and respect. She stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she lowered them to her lap. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but sincere. She felt a warmth in her chest, not from the praise alone, but from the recognition that her life story had been understood, even in part through her music. As she stepped away from the piano, the judges made brief notes and then invited her to wait outside. The hallway felt lighter than before. Contestants who had previously mocked her now looked on in quiet admiration. Some even approached cautiously, expressing their surprise and respect. One young man whose smug expression had annoyed her the first day now said quietly, "I didn't know someone could play like that." She offered a gentle smile in response, not out of pride, but out of acknowledgement. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet reflection. She returned home, her small piano waiting as if it had missed her. She played the piece once more, letting herself explore the emotions she had carried but could not yet fully express. Each repetition felt richer, more layered, as though the experience of the audition had awakened something new within her. Days turned into weeks, and the results of the competition were slowly announced. She received word that her performance had touched everyone present, judges, contestants, and even those who had only heard whispers from outside the audition room. Invitations arrived for local performances, teaching opportunities, and interviews. Yet she approached them with humility. She did not seek fame or recognition. She sought only to continue expressing the music that had defined her life. Her story, however, began to spread quietly but steadily. People in her town learned of her success, and their perception shifted. Neighbors who had once overlooked her presence now spoke with admiration. Children she had taught listened with renewed interest, inspired by the idea that dedication, courage, and honesty could overcome even the harshest judgments. She continued to play every evening, exploring new melodies and perfecting old ones. Her music became not just a personal refuge, but a source of inspiration for those around her. Through the keys, she communicated experiences too profound for words, connecting with others in a way that transcended speech. The woman understood that her journey was far from over. There would be more performances, more challenges, and moments of doubt. But she now carried a quiet confidence born of proof that genuine talent and heartfelt expression could touch hearts in ways no appearance, age, or societal expectation could ever diminish. She also realized that the true reward was not applause, recognition, or accolades. It was the ability to live authentically, to honor her past, and to share the depth of her experiences through the one language she had always known best: music. Each note she played was a testament to resilience, to the quiet courage of ordinary life, and to the power of persistence and belief. And so, the woman who had once been ridiculed for her simplicity now walked with a quiet grace. She continued to play not to impress but to express, and in doing so she had already achieved something far greater than any award. She had shown that life, in all its hardships and beauty, could be transformed into art, into melody, and into inspiration. Every time she sat at her piano, she felt the presence of everyone she had loved, lost, and remember. Each note was a bridge to the past and a promise to the future. And in that music, she found peace, fulfillment, and the knowledge that she had truly, finally, found her voice. The video of her performance spread across the internet faster than anyone expected. At first, Lena didn't even know she had become famous. She was back in her small apartment doing her usual chores when her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Friends, neighbors, even people she hadn't spoken to in years called to say they had seen her on social media. Someone had recorded her performance and posted it with the title, "The Simple Woman Who Shocked Everyone at the Piano Audition." Within hours, millions had watched it. The comments were filled with words that made her tear up. People said they felt her emotions through every note. Some wrote that her performance gave them courage to start over in their own lives. Others said it reminded them of their mothers, their grandmothers, or someone who had quietly struggled but never gave up. Lena sat on her couch holding her phone, feeling as if the world had suddenly opened its heart to her. The next few days were overwhelming. Journalists came to her door asking for interviews. A local TV channel wanted to feature her story. She was shy at first, unsure of what to say. She didn't feel like a celebrity or a hero. She was still the same woman who cleaned, cooked, and practiced the piano when she could, but she agreed to speak because she wanted to share something honest. She told them that music was never about fame or competition for her. It was about healing. It was about having something to hold on to when life felt too heavy. When the interview aired, people connected even more deeply with her. They said she reminded them that dreams don't have an expiry date. Her sincerity touched everyone. Some of the same people who had laughed at her during the audition reached out to apologize. They said they had learned not to judge anyone by how they look or where they come from. Lena forgave them easily. She said, "We all learn in different ways. Sometimes it takes a little shock to open our eyes." Not long after, she received an invitation from a prestigious music school. They wanted her to visit and talk to students about her journey. The idea scared her at first. She had never spoken to such a large crowd before. But she accepted because she knew her story could help others. On the day of her visit, she wore the same simple dress she had worn to the audition. When she walked into the hall, hundreds of young faces turned toward her. Some expected a confident professional pianist, but what they saw was a humble woman with gentle eyes. She began to speak slowly, from the heart. She told them about her struggles, how she worked long hours cleaning offices, how she played the piano late at night when the world was asleep, how she almost gave up more than once. She told them how she had been mocked, how her hands shook on stage, and how she played through her fear. The students listened quietly, some wiping away tears. When she finished, the entire room stood up to clap for her. One of the teachers whispered, "She taught them more about music today than any lesson could." After that day, invitations started coming from everywhere. Community centers, local theaters, charity events, everyone wanted her to perform. But Lena didn't want to chase fame. She only chose the ones that meant something to her. She performed for children with disabilities, for elderly homes, and at small charity concerts. She played with all the warmth she had, and every time, the audience left with tears in their eyes and smiles on their faces. One evening, she received a letter from a little girl named Mia. The letter said, "When I watched your video, I started to believe I can be brave too. I've been afraid to play piano at school because people laugh at my mistakes. But now I will try again." Lena held that letter for a long time. She realized that her dream had grown bigger than herself. It wasn't just about proving she could play. It was about inspiring others to try, no matter what people say. Months passed, but Lena's life didn't change in the way fame often changes people. She still lived simply. She still cooked her own meals and took long walks in the park. But now her days had new meaning. Wherever she went, people recognized her and thanked her for touching their hearts. Some asked for advice, and she always said the same thing. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Just start where you are. The world doesn't need perfection. It needs honesty. One afternoon, she returned to the same auditorium where everything had begun. The organizers invited her to be a guest performer for the next round of auditions. As she entered the hall, she noticed new contestants nervously waiting just as she once did. Some were confident, others terrified. She could see herself in their eyes. When she was called to the stage, the crowd greeted her with respect and admiration. The same judges who had doubted her now smiled warmly. She sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and played again, not to impress anyone, but to share a piece of her soul. Her fingers danced over the keys, gentle and sure. The melody floated softly through the hall like a warm breeze. It was not the same piece she had played before. This one was calmer, full of peace and gratitude. As the last note faded, there was silence for a moment, then thunderous applause. People stood up again, but this time Lena didn't cry. She just smiled quietly, knowing this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of many others. After the performance, a young contestant approached her. He said, "I was afraid to go on stage today, but seeing you play gave me courage." She patted his hand and said gently, "That's how music works. It gives what words can't." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and went on stage right after her. His performance was shaky but full of heart. Lena clapped for him the loudest. In the following weeks, her story continued to spread around the world. News outlets from other countries shared her video. People called her the soul pianist, the woman who played life's melody, and the heart that healed through music. But Lena never let these titles change her. She always said, "I'm just someone who loves to play." A few months later, she organized her own small concert in her hometown. It was held in the same community hall where she had once practiced alone after work. This time, the room was filled with families, children, and friends. She invited local musicians, especially beginners, to perform with her. There were mistakes, off notes, laughter, and tears, but the evening felt real, full of life. Before her final song, she spoke softly into the microphone. "I used to think dreams had a time limit, but now I know. They wait patiently until we are ready." She began playing a tune she had written herself. It was called The Second Chance. The melody was gentle and warm, filled with the joy of rediscovered hope. People in the audience swayed quietly, holding hands, some crying softly. When the last note lingered in the air, the entire hall stood again, clapping endlessly. Lena stood up, bowed slightly, and smiled through tears. For the first time, she felt that she had truly lived her dream. After the concert, children surrounded her, asking to learn piano from her. She didn't have a fancy studio or expensive instruments, but she invited them to her home. Every weekend, they gathered around her old keyboard. She taught them not only how to play, but how to feel. She told them, "A song isn't about how perfect you play, it's about what you mean when you play." The children adored her. Her small living room filled with laughter, music, and a sense of belonging. Years passed, and though her hands became slower, her spirit remained strong. She still played every morning, even when her fingers ached. Sometimes she played alone, sometimes with her students, sometimes for people who just wanted to listen and feel peace for a while. Music had become her way of giving back to life what life had once taken from her. One afternoon, as she sat by the window with her keyboard, she watched children running outside and smiled. The sun touched her face, and a feeling of deep gratitude filled her heart. She remembered the day people had laughed at her, the fear she had felt, the moment she almost walked away. She thought about how everything changed because she chose to stay and play her truth. She whispered softly to herself, that one choice made all the difference. And in that quiet moment, she pressed a single key, a soft, sweet note that faded slowly into the air, like a memory that never truly ends. Her story became more than just a viral video or a headline. It became a living reminder that no dream is too old, no person too simple, and no moment too late. She proved that courage can turn ridicule into respect, and that even a single melody played from the heart can awaken hope in millions. In the end, Lena didn't just become known as the woman who shocked everyone. She became a symbol of what it means to believe in yourself when no one else does. Her name might fade someday, but her music will live on in every person who dares to begin again, no matter how small or unseen they feel. And for Lena, that was more than enough.